Welcome to the Women at the Top podcast interview series. My name is Regina Barr, and I'm the founder of the Women at the Top Network. I'm going to be your host today. And joining me today is John O'Brien. He's an author, licensed psychologist, professional speaker, and executive coach out of Portland, Maine, with over 30 years in the mental health field. He is the founder of two successful businesses and has held leadership positions in many professional organizations. He serves as an adjunct professor at the University of Maine at Augusta, teaching courses in psychology, trauma, and addiction related topics. He equips people with tangible skills and concrete tools that empower them to swiftly reduce stress levels and enhance wellness. John is the author of Rudeness Rehab, Reclaiming Civility in the Workplace and Your Home Space. I love that title. So thank you for joining us today, John.
Oh, Regina, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yes, I just think that this conversation is very timely, and your book focuses on rudeness and incivility,
Mhm.
which I think can be problematic in our current work, business, home, social, whatever environment. And I always like to get the backstory on a book from our authors. So tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write the book, Rudeness Rehab.
Okay. Well, when I first entered the training program to get my master's in counseling psychology, we were encouraged to do some self-reflection of ourselves. And being the dutiful student I did, and at that time just came to understand that there was a part of me that could be rude. So I kind of just noticed that and thought that's important to manage. And through my training into my PhD program and beyond, and in working with clients, there was always this idea of helping people manage interpersonal relationships. Fast forward to 2017, I heard Dr. Christine Porath, who is a expert on this and has done a lot of research, speak, and it was like a light bulb went off for me. And then we went into the pandemic, and I just saw how people were treating each other at a time when ideally our country would come together. It just seemed like we became further divided, and especially the way people were treating frontline workers and healthcare workers. And that I thought as the pandemic started to wane, maybe that type of behavior would diminish, but it didn't. And that's really what propelled me to write the book to kind of empower people about how to manage what is now a pandemic of rudeness.
Hmm. I agree with that. And thinking about that time frame, right? What changed? We all went online. We all
Hmm.
went to sitting behind cameras and kind of out on social media where we have some anonymity. Even when you're on camera like this, if you're not face to face, you still have some anonymity. You know what I mean? That you're not sitting right next to someone where you have to kind of look them in the eye, right? I mean, right now I'm trying to look you in the eye, but really I'm trying to look at the camera. Otherwise, right, it looks like I'm looking away. So
Right,
if I were to look down where I actually can see you, then it looks like maybe I'm doing something else or reading my notes for today's call. So
right.
if I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, it's even more of a disconnect because I'm looking straight on at the camera when I'm really wanting to look at the video views. So, do you feel like some of what was going on at that time and us moving away from all the face to face into this sort of space of anonymity also had something to do with that? And we haven't left that space of anonymity.
A- Absolutely. I think there's some psychological disconnection that goes along with the physical disconnection, even though, for example, you and I are interacting now, there's still, it's not the same as if we were together in person, right?
Right.
And I think that the pandemic created a huge amount of isolation, necessary isolation, but in that isolation, people became less equipped or less familiar with relating to one another. And now trying to come back together, people still struggle with that.
I couldn't agree more with that. So glad we are having this conversation today, even if we are in a remote environment.
Right, right.
So, the book is really about getting you to think about the less obvious ways that we treat each other poorly and the
Mhm.
negative impacts that these behaviors can have on our physical and emotional health. And I would hazard a guess, not only on the recipient of those behaviors, but also ourselves. So
Mhm.
tell us a little bit about how do you define incivility?
Um, well, Just interesting, I would say that if you, just as an aside, but if you go into Amazon and type in incivility for a topic, it autocorrects to invisibility.
Oh,
So it's almost like Amazon isn't comfortable with the term. We're still trying to get comfortable with what the term actually means. But the way I think about it, it's rude or inconsiderate behavior that may or may not be intentional, but that nonetheless causes stress in the person who's the target of the behavior. People who witness it also experience impacts of it, negative impacts, and even boomeranging around eventually to the person who is uncivil, because oftentimes they get something similar in return from other people. So it's really
hmm.
quite a toxic mix of people affected.
I'm glad you talked a little bit about the boomerang for people who witness it, because
Hmm.
sometimes I think we've all witnessed something where we just feel cringe, right? Like that little feeling in our stomach, like, ugh, that is horrible.
Yes.
Um, so I'm glad that you mentioned that as well. And, uh, it's interesting, I think, in certain cultures or certain cities or environments. I grew up in New York, but my family, my mom grew up in Minnesota, and I would say we probably have less tolerance for certain behaviors or perceive certain behaviors to be more in, inconsiderate or rude in Minnesota than perhaps we might see them in New York. So I think sometimes some of it could be generational too. So we have different factors that can also influence that, which I find interesting. But what I would like to talk about, unfortunately, is how hate and division have become much more prevalent in our society. And
Hmm.
unless you're living in a closet, all you have to do is turn on the TV or jump onto social media for one half of a second. I want to go out and see my DIY stuff. And then all of a
Uh-huh.
sudden something will come up in my feed and I'm like, whoa, I'm like, I just wanted to see how to, redo a wreath or something. And then it's something completely out there. So
Yes.
um, this hate and division is having a huge impact carried over into the work environment. So tell us, how does it, this rudeness and incivility play out in the workplace? What's the impact there?
Well, I would say by introduction, when Christine Porath first examined people in the workplace in 2005, she asked people about experiencing incivility in their workplace. At that point, about 50% of people, half, said they had experienced incivility at least once in the last month. When she repeated that research in 2022, a few years ago, that number was 76%. And the people of the people who were experiencing incivility, 70%, over two-thirds, said they were seeing 3 or more incidents in their work environment every month. So in other words, it's very prevalent for people. They're seeing it much more. And I call it a pandemic because it is very much like an infection that gets passed around very
Mm.
quickly. um, if one person engages in incivility, that can kind of spread and impact other people. And if it's not well managed in a work environment, it can create a real toxic work culture, which
Yes.
leads employees and peers to feel demotivated, disconnected, and therefore to see a decline in their productivity, and which then leads to diminished profits for the business. And even ultimately, I've seen instances where it's led to the demise of a business.
Hmm.
That's the business impact. And then for individuals, there certainly are the effects that we see of stress, you know, physical effects like, headaches and stomach aches and greater likelihood of illnesses, and sometimes building up to even more serious illness. So there's an effect for the business and the individual.
So we all need to be thinking about it. I can tell you, I know there have been times, and I try really hard, and I suspect you do too. Like we're kind of with the coaching work and sort of the profession that we're in. Um, I try to model good behavior. I put a lot of
Hmm.
pressure on myself to do that. But sometimes I always tell people I'm a human being and I get tired or I don't feel well or I'm in a hurry and then something happens. And I always try to take a step back and apologize.
Hmm.
And I can tell you when I do that, people are beyond shocked. Like where I've said, gosh,
Yeah.
I need to stop myself here. I'm really sorry. I'm not feeling well. That's not your problem. I apologize. I was very rude and uh, I don't want to. end our interaction on this way? Can we start over? And like, I think sometimes people want to fall over, but I think, I don't remember who quoted this, maybe you do, but you got to be the change you want to see out in the world. So I
Hmm.
feel like that's true, because you just talked about how this is a pandemic. It is infectious. And if you're an influencer at work and you engage in that behavior, you make it okay for other people to engage in that behavior.
Absolutely.
So a lot of the folks that are either watching us today or listening in today, they're women
Hmm.
in the workplace, corporate leaders, business owners. We have some men too, but a lot of women.
Hmm.
And so, can you talk about some specific ways that women leaders experience incivility in the workplace? That's a tongue twister.
It is.
Um, what are some of the ways that you see specific to women, if there are specific ways?
Oh, there are. I mean, just to state the obvious that I'm not a woman, so I don't know exactly what women's experiences are, and I'm always a little shaky on like generalizing for what, all women are all men, but I do have some thoughts about with the women leaders I have worked with, some of
Okay.
the things that they have seen. One is interrupting. That more often in meetings, I think women leaders find that men are more than happy to sort of hop in and take the floor in terms of speaking, and that it's harder for them to get a word in, but also even when they do, that other people cut them off, and they have to figure out whether do I continue to push forward and say I wasn't finished, and the struggle about how to manage that. So that's one thing.
Hmm.
I think also assumptions that people can make about um, either that the experience of men and women or other people who have diverse backgrounds, like everybody's experience is the same, and not understanding that there are differences of experience, um, or assuming that someone needs something explained to them. I think the term mansplaining. I don't like that term,
I
but
was
it's
just going to say, we women don't like to be mansplained.
exactly right. No, absolutely. And guess what? Men don't like to be mansplained either. So we're many men. Um, I think the other thing is sometimes colleagues will make inappropriate or sexist comments and not realize that. So I'm thinking of one um, female leader I worked with who was up for promotion and she didn't get it. And when she asked her boss why she didn't get it, her boss said, um, well, I figured since you're a mother, you would want to be focusing more on your family.
Ooh,
Now, what I will say of interest is, in fact, the boss was a woman.
it doesn't
So,
matter. You don't say things like that.
exactly,
I
right?
would hope at this stage of my career and the work that I've done, I would hope people would not think those things, but there you have it, right?
Well, they do, and so she was able to sort of have a further conversation about that. She ultimately had to leave that organization, but right. So those are the ways that I think about that are women specific. That I'm sure there are more, but those are some examples.
Yeah, well, thank you for doing that. It's interesting. I mentioned that I grew up in New York, and I also should mention I had three brothers. So I like to say that growing up with three brothers, it prepared me well for the corporate environment, because, we were always kind of it's like fighter pilots in limited airspace are all like vying for our space. And
Yeah.
like, I kind of learned how to really hold my own, right?
Hmm.
And how to get my needs met in an environment where, I was dealing with three guys and, elbowing and whatever, and doing it in my frilly little dresses and things like that from back in the day. So, sometimes it's interesting, you mentioned this woman boss who exhibited sexist behavior. Sometimes I feel like I have some manly behaviors,
Hmm.
and I have learned how to insert myself, and if I'm interrupted or being mansplained, to say, you know what, I'm sorry, um, I totally have it, and then I say the point I'm trying to make is whatever. So I kind of like have my own way of putting that down. But sometimes if a man did that, it would be perceived one way as acceptable, but I could come off as appearing to be rude. And the people who might think most of all that I'm rude would be the women,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Like, oh my
Right.
gosh, she's, look at what she did. I can't believe, can you believe she did that? But yet, we can't be nice girls all the time, or we're going to continuously feel that we're undervalued and underappreciated. So
Hmm.
I appreciate you bringing that up and sharing your observations on that. So, what I
Hmm.
want to also ask you a little bit about is what do you suggest that workers do to help manage that incivility in the workplace and in their work relationships, and where can they go for help?
Well, I think some people feel skilled enough, and they may to try to interact with whoever is being uncivil directly, especially if they have a good relationship, because sometimes, as I've said, incivility is unintentional, and people are a little bit blind to what they're doing. Obviously, it's going to depend upon what we're talking about here as far as the
Hmm.
behavior is concerned. But you may feel skilled enough and have a good enough relationship with the person where you can deal with them directly. Um, I think, that thinking about what level you are in the organization
Hmm.
matters, and who are your allies. What kind of relationship do you have with your boss? And do you have a good enough relationship where you can speak to your boss and kind of get help thinking about how to manage this work relationship, um, without it necessarily then appearing in your performance review
Yes.
down the
Hmm.
road as like has difficulty interacting with colleagues or something. So
Hmm.
you have to trust that you have a good working relationship with your boss. Sometimes people can get a great deal of help from HR. And I have friends who work in HR, so that could be true. At the same time, I've also known people who've gone to HR and
Yes.
felt as if HR wasn't confidential, quite frankly. Um,
I'm glad you said that because that's an important conversation. You have to get the layout of the land in your organization. Hmm.
yes, absolutely. And know kind of who are your allies, who can you rely on, who can you have confidential conversations with. The other thing is sort of, I was alluding to it earlier, but who is the source of the incivility? Because sometimes there are people in organizations that are significant individual contributors that have been protected,
Hmm.
um, for many years, and the organization is maybe resistant or completely resistant to do anything about it. So you really have to know, um, what's the history, what's the
Right.
person's role in the organization. Sometimes people can speak to a mentor. Sometimes people actually want to hire a coach,
Hmm.
around interpersonal things and figuring these things out. So there's lots of different ways to go about it. It just depends on what the situation is and what the individual feels like is going to be most
That they can
beneficial.
do. You
Right.
know, I'm glad you alluded to it depends on the relationships because very often we want to address the incivility, but we also need to preserve the relationships. And that's just the reality. I mean, well, I would hope you would want to preserve relationships socially
Hmm.
or, out in other areas of the community in which you live and work, whatever. But especially at work, right? Where you're spending a lot of
Yes.
time and people have control over your performance review and ultimately your success in that organization. But the thing I also wanted to that you were kind of touching on was the power differential. You
Hmm.
really have to be astute and have some acumen around that, and it's really about being aware. I'm trying to think of situational awareness.
Hmm.
Couldn't think of the word of your organization, the individual relationship, and so you kind of have to drill down into some of that. But having said all of that, um, I would love to know, given we're talking about women and we alluded to some of the things that types of incivility that women may experience, what are some things that they can do or try to counterbalance that rudeness or incivility in the workplace?
Well, you know, I I teach people lots of skills, but as a summary statement, you may remember in the Wonder Woman comics that when she was
Sh-
fighting off
sh-
someone, BAM, right, was one of the things. BAM. So BAM is actually an acronym I use with people. So it's breathing, active listening, and mindfulness. So don't forget the power of your breath. There's lots of material out there on centering yourself with abdominal breathing. Um, that there's work of Andrew Huberman around something called the stacked physiological sigh. I recommend that highly. Check that out. So that's the breathing part. Active listening, obviously, is about, rather than responding to someone with your thoughts on it, you're saying things or doing things to reflect back to people what they have said. And sometimes if you reflect back, people realize that they've been rude, or uncivil. So sometimes if you do that, you just say, so you mean that, are you saying I'm not up to the task or something like that? And that
Yeah.
by reflecting back, well, I didn't mean that at all. Or it gives people that mirror that they sometimes need. And
Yes.
then mindfulness. There's lots of different material out there about mindfulness. I'd encourage people to check out material on the four-step mindfulness. People are welcome to go to my website on activatesuccess.org. I have a little video on the four-step mindfulness, but there's lots of material out there. It's about basically centering yourself and being planful about how you want to respond in a situation. So when faced with incivility, bam.
Bam. I did the, do you remember the,
I saw that.
yes. So I was chuckling when you were talking about the stacked breathing. I'm assuming it's not this. Because like I always try to tell people like poker face, your reaction. And so I do like some of your very practical and tactical tips.
Yeah,
And I'll see if we can't maybe drop your four-step mindfulness process into the show notes or have a link out there so people can go to your website and see that.
great.
So I want to shift a little bit to about a topic that I think has gained more prominence over the last several years. I think really
Hmm.
coming out of COVID or when we got into COVID because people were so isolated. And that's your book talks about mental health based approaches in dealing with rudeness and incivility. And obviously, you're a licensed psychologist, and I do think it's important that we talk a little bit about mental health. Now, obviously,
Hmm.
here it's very big picture. But sometimes there can be mental health challenges in the workplace, and I'm glad for people that it's coming out more in the open. So I just like
Yes.
to do that little PSA. And then from a more practical and tactical standpoint, what are some of the skills or tools that our viewers or listeners um, can use when it comes to taking a more mental health approach?
Do you mean to incivility or do you mean to stress in the workplace in general or?
Rudeness and incivility.
Okay,
But if
okay.
you prefer to tie in a little bit of stress, because let's face it, right? When are we more inclined to be uncivil to someone or rude to someone? It's when we're under stress. When everything is hunky dory, we're less likely to be that way. I always joke around, gosh, my day is so organized, things are going so smoothly. Oh God, it's going to be a great day. And then I joke around and say, and then I got out of bed, and it was like, oh my gosh, what happened, right?
Right. Yes,
So
yes.
it's not when things are going smoothly. It is what typically when we're more inclined. Now there are some people who are just rude because they're rude people, but
Yeah.
most people it's they're under some duress or stress or other things are going on. So that's what I'm kind of focusing on.
Gotcha. Okay. Yes, and as you said, few people like before they get out of bed in the morning, they think, how many people can I irritate today? It's that's not their maybe a few,
No.
but well, in terms of your question, I would certainly suggest those skills around BAM,
Yep.
breathing and active listening and mindfulness. But I think one of the more effective tools sort of begins with ourselves and making sure that we are as balanced as we can be. We can't always be completely balanced, but making sure that you're doing things for yourself, like exercising regularly, and balancing nutrition, working to get enough sleep. We, as as a culture, I think, are not good at any of those things. We tend to not eat healthy. We don't get enough exercise in terms of the guidelines, and we don't sleep enough. So many people are sleep deprived because of numerous stresses and children and parents and finances and all that. So figuring out what are the things we need to do to help keep ourselves balanced, because being able to manage incivility in the world really begins with ourselves.
So I have to tell you, I appreciate that you're using the term balanced because a lot of times I hear people say boundaries, and
Hmm.
I found I relocated my mom from New York, and that's created some additional stressors on
Hmm.
me, and she's not driving any longer. And I found that people were always saying, well, you have to have some boundaries. You have to have some boundaries. I don't really want to have a lot of that sounds so negative to me,
Mm.
boundaries with my mom, who I love to death. but I like the word balance, and that's what I started talking with my mom. We got to find some balance of how we're going to work together, and how often I'm going to come over, and let's be a little more planful about our time together, because I don't want our time just to be, I'm taking you shopping to run and to 3 stores and get your stuff, and then we spend no quality time together. So I really, appreciate the balance, and I also appreciate getting back to some of the basics, because I think, we think we have to do something very grand and big to work through some of these things, and sometimes it's the little things. I think there's a reason we have a term called hangry in in the world. Like, I don't know when that came into place, but
Mhm.
I went to a closing. I'm also a realtor in addition to speaker and a coach, and it was at 11 o'clock. I knew it might go long. I brought protein bars,
Mhm.
and I will tell you, every person in that room, because we had some things go wrong and we were there for almost 2 hours, ate one of the protein bars. So I joked and I said, I don't want any hangry people in the room today. So please, here, if you need it, take it, whatever. So I want to shift our conversation just a little bit.
Mhm.
Um, we had started talking about this a little bit earlier, that we work with leaders, people at different levels. Sometimes it could be underlings, peers, senior folks in the workplace. And sometimes we started talking about this power differential, which can add that other element. So,
Mhm.
should people respond differently if it's the CEO of the company or some other senior level person, whether it's their boss or not? And
Well,
why? Why should we treat other people with the kid gloves, if you will?
well, I think of in this instance 3 Ps. So it's position, power, and politics. So understanding, okay, what's the individual's position? Like what's your role in the organization and what's the role of the person who is being uncivil? Um, and 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 sometimes the people that have a lot of power in an organization aren't necessarily the ones with the highest levels of position. Sometimes people have been
Mhm.
there a long time, so you have to sort of be thinking about that, as well as like who has connections with who, the politics of the situation. So I would say, in some ways, it may be easier to deal with incivility in a direct report because you have more, but sometimes there are challenges there if the direct report maybe pushes back against some of your requests. So
Mhm.
you have to navigate that carefully. I think with a peer, um, you're at the same level, and so it, in some ways, and again, depending upon your relationship, it may be easier to navigate that. And if it's someone who is a bigger dog in the organization, well, that's often where you have to, what's been your ongoing relationship with this person? Is this a one-off? Is this how they usually are? mm, that you may need to try to gather support from other people, either in the organization or your mentors or your coach, about whether or not it's worth trying to
Right.
address, and if you do address it, how to do so.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And it's interesting. The reason I asked, like, should we be treating these people with kid gloves, is because sometimes what happens is these more senior level leaders, I'm really talking about the C level, because
Hmm.
I've done a lot of consulting and coaching at that level. And sometimes they're in their little ivory tower and they have no idea. Like, no, everyone's afraid to be a mirror. And sometimes I've had to be the mirror for them. Even when I wasn't their coach, I might have been consulting on a project, but I'm like watching all the fallout from this person, and I'll schedule a meeting and I'll be there to do like a project update. And then I'll say, "Hey, do you mind if I put on my coaching hat for a moment?"
Hmm.
And I do this and they look and they get a little uncomfortable. And then I kind of tell them like it is, right? And then I'm like, okay, I'm going to take my coaching hat off now and I get back to business. But that's why I ask, because sometimes these people don't realize it. Some of them do. And I've had a person say to me, "Oh, yeah, I know. I'm always like that." And I was like, "Oh, do you think that's really effective? I'm not sure if you really noticed the impact that you had on your team."
Right.
Right? It's like,
Absolutely. Yep.
so it's hard to believe this time went quickly, but we are winding down on time. And I
Hmm.
always like to close out my interviews with asking if you could only give one piece of advice to our viewers or listeners today with regards to rudeness, incivility, or how to improve that in the workplace or your home space to
Hmm.
tie back to the title of your book. What would that be? What would you want people to leave our time together today?
Well, recognize that we all have stress-related negative behaviors. We all have them. And it's when we are out of balance that those are more likely to manifest. So my advice would be do your best to be in more balance so you're less likely to have those behaviors emerge, but also know what they are so that if you start to see them emerging, you know that you have to step back and do a better job of managing yourself because managing incivility with others begins with managing yourself.
I love that. And it kind of goes back to what you had said earlier, being mindful, like being
Hmm.
aware of those behaviors in yourself or triggers in yourself as well. So,
Yeah.
well, that's all we have time for today. And I do want to say thank you so much for joining us today, John. It truly has been fun and a pleasure to be with you. And I also want to say a big thank you to our viewers and listeners for joining us today. See you all next time.